Good evening. Welcome everybody to Books and Books at Bell Harbor Shops. I'm Kathy Leff, and I'm with the Fashion Project, just adjacent. First, I want to thank Books and Books for being a partner to Fashion Project since it was conceived in April of 2015 as an experimental curatorial space that explores the display and culture surrounding the broader culture surrounding fashion and its design, consumption, production, and dissemination. And I'm so honored that we have here tonight with us Judith Clark, who has been our in-house curatorial, I guess our special curator of the project, and curating and designing the series that have been produced over the course of the year. I want to let everybody know that this talk tonight is being live streamed thanks to a generous grant to Books and Books from the Knight Foundation. So thank you, Knight Foundation, and I hope everybody out there is enjoying it. I also want to thank Mark Swanberg. Where are you, Mark, from Books and Books, and the entire Books and Books team, who are always so collaborative and cooperative. And I want to really recognize the Fashion Project team, who are the ones who make it all possible here on the ground. And first I want to say thank you to Samantha Traeger over here, who is the manager of Fashion Project. Alessandra Savarelli, Alejandra, are you? She's still over there. And Luisa Jimenez. They're a real amazing dynamic trio who not only help manage the space, but coordinate all the programming that is offered throughout the year. So please feel free. I think you're either sitting on or have in your hands a copy of the little exhibition brochure, as well as the programming through the end of January. And we hope that you'll join us for some of those programs, if not all of them. And next Thursday, we're really honored. We not only have her here tonight, but she's making a face. The iconic Barbara Hulanicki, and we'll be celebrating her and talking about her work in the 60s in London and beyond. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our guests tonight. Again, Judith, thank you so much for an extraordinary exhibition and series that you put together, and for coming all the way over here for that. And this has really been a special project, and they'll talk more about the process and the project. But if you haven't seen the past or the prior two exhibitions that preceded it, then I hope you'll do so following the exhibition, and it'll remain on view through November 5th. And it'll be followed by the anniversary. So the whole series is cumulative, but the past and the anniversary look at a centenary of fashion history, exhibition making, and exhibition display. So tonight's program is Making the Past New, two attitudes towards curating fashion. And not only are we lucky to have Judith Clark, as I mentioned, the curator of the series, an exhibition maker, here with us, but joined by a colleague of hers, Amy de la Haye. So Judith, aside from our curator, is a professor at the University of Arts, the College of Fashion, at the co-director and co-founder, along with Amy, of the Center for Fashion Curation at the College of Fashion at the University of Arts in London. It's a long name. She teaches fashion and museology, and Amy teaches the same. But different. They're partners in crimes in many ways, and have done all kinds of incredible things. And in fact, one of the books that they collaborated on, Exhibiting Fashion Before and After 1971, is actually available for purchase and signing following the talk tonight. We also have some publications here, Books and Books, that Judith has worked on. So please browse and take a look at those. To Judith and Amy to talk about what we're here for. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Of course, it's really thanks to Kathy that we're here at all. So we're grateful to her for her generosity and hospitality that has spanned the whole year. I'm going to kick off this evening with a little bit of context. Some of you have already been into the exhibition next door. It's called The Past, and as Kathy said, it's the third in a series of exhibitions, and it's intended to be a cumulative, not only as an idea around exhibitions, but I mean the dialogues that spring from the idea of fashion and exhibition making. And for this third exhibition, it's called The Past, and it's about attitudes to the past. And two attitudes, in a way, go through the exhibition. One is looking again at two moments from our past. One is the centenary, the 100 years ago, which is 1915, and the other 50 years ago, which is 1965, of course. And 1965 is a very important date because it's when Pearl Harbor was built. So both important dates. So we've decided to juxtapose those two moments, and when conceiving of the exhibition, I thought, well, it's about attitudes to the past, and one thing that it made me think of was the conversations that I'm so privileged to have with Professor Amy de la Haye within the college in London. And in a way, it's the difference in our approaches that sparks off so many conversations between us, and I thought it would be lovely to do that here, both within the exhibition, which is itself a dialogue between the two of us, the catalogue, but also this evening's event. So that, in a way, is the context for this conversation. And so I wanted to take advantage of the fact that Amy had come to Miami with me this time to ask her and share with you her attitude to the past and the uses of the past, and in a way her reflections on the past, which are so dear to us both, but in different ways. And so I just wonder, Amy, whether you could kind of in a way summarize, if it's possible, your attitude to the past as a curator. What is the past for you?
Okay, could we go to the fourth image? Well, there was a poignant moment when we were installing the exhibition yesterday. There was a team of 4 of us, all doing very, very different things. And in the op art section, there's sort of an optical illusion with the vinyl. And Judith was looking at the optical illusion and the point at which it came. And there's a dress, and one of the sort of technicians said it was really funny because he talked to Judith, and Judith was very, very keen on the aesthetic of the op art, and that all I saw was the dress. I mean, of course, we both see both, but to me, it was the point at which what you could see of the dress. And so, until very recently, I've said I'm an object-led dress curator, which I always took to mean that it's the object that inspires me. So it might be a pair of Land's Army breeches. It might be the daisy motif, which I became obsessed about in Judith's exhibition. But I think recently I realised that, yes, I'm an object-led dress curator, but actually I'm interested in lives, and in particular in women's lives. And the way that I unravel those histories is by using dress. And so my interest is not always, I mean, I worked at the V&A as curator for a long time, so my preoccupation there was sort of design-led. But in my heart, I think, and more, I'm really interested in worn clothes. And they can be worn clothes of any sort or any quality. And it's using those clothes as a hook into the lives of the women who wore them. And I'm interested in the clothes as part of the lives of the women, but I'm also interested in the second life of the clothes. When, at the point at which clothes are no longer worn and they enter the museum, where they serve new use values and new meanings. So they're no longer there to be worn, they're not objects of consumption, they're primarily objects of interpretation. And Samantha asked me if I wanted to bring an image. And so the image I've brought, it's a detail. Judith and I worked on a couple of films in a series called 1914 Now. My film was based on a dress in Brighton Museum that's called a tea gown. And it's a garment that we're completely unfamiliar with now. It was worn certainly from about the 1870s up until the First World War by middle-class women upwards. And it was they would change maybe 7 times a day, and at tea time, they were offered temporary respite by wearing a tea gown. And a tea gown, compared to all their other corseted clothes, was loose and flowing, even though they did actually have bones in them. And a woman could receive female friends thus attired, or would just sit at home, and it offered some respite between, you know, wearing tailored or corseted dress all day and then getting dressed for evening. And so I became very interested in this garment. I mean, even its nomenclature today, I'm interested in terminology too, but you know, the thought of a tea gown, it's something that none of us really think about or could relate to. So in some ways it's completely pre-modern, but in other ways, because it's the beginning of comfortable clothes for women, we could also consider it as, you know, we're talking about telling histories, we could also tell a history where the tea gown is the precursor of the onesie. You know, we can tell all sorts of narratives that we want. But this gown was the focus of a film that I worked on, and it's a tea gown in Brighton Museum. It's the sort of garment that was accepted years ago. It's got no documentation. It's not in so bad a condition that it's likely to be disposed of, but nor is it ever likely to be exhibited. There's nothing particularly special about it. It's a middle-level garment. It's been worn. It's got stains on it, and it's without context. So it's got a number. And because it was worn sort of in war, it also temporarily reminded me of sort of like the idea of the lost soldier. But it was just, I suppose my attitude is that there's something magical about this garment that we know so little about, and that we could construct all sorts of narratives. And yet we know it's worn, we don't know who wore it. But we know that it was worn at a point in time. We can compare it to other garments that are more exclusive or much cheaper. It's the fact that it's stained as well. It's poignant. It sort of resonates with human life. It's been touched by humanity, and I think that's what does something to my inside.
There are different things that I wanted to ask you about and come back to. I mean, one of the things about doing a project here is the idea of creating a space that differentiates itself from a retail environment, even though, of course, it's dominated by a retail environment. And so the past is particularly important in a way as an idea, because these are pieces that are no longer for consumption. And I think there's a kind of freedom when looking at the past, is that the criteria for desirability changes. It's about what an object can tell you about something, rather than a projected idea of oneself in the future, or whatever we do when we're looking at fashion. And so I think the past is also very kind of liberating, isn't it? That it can be about specialness, and it can be about preciousness, but it's about how eloquent the object is according to the eyes of the viewer and the visitor. And I think we're always creating links between an object and something else. And I guess it's about evoking something. And I think with a retail environment, in a way, people are filling the void with themselves a lot of the time. You know, we're not really overly worried about what the mannequin is telling us, other than it is a kind of glamorous proposition of a body or our body or someone desirable's body in the immediate future. Whereas I think with the past, let's say, if we're going to use these kind of incredibly broad categories, there's a different idea of absence, isn't there? I mean, what's your attitude to kind of the mannequin, if you like? How do you evoke what is missing, which is, of course, poignantly the body, because you're talking about the person who is unknown. But even that needs to be evoked within a museum.
Well, we have different dilemmas, don't we, on our different exhibitions, but when I worked at the V&A, if I worked with contemporary fashion, you could work with contemporary fashion mannequins, because they're sample garments made for the standard mannequin. The issue comes when it's a bespoke garment, whether it's tailored or couture made for the individual body. Few people's bodies, very, very few people, conform to those, the dimensions of the mannequin. But it's not only mannequins, they project certain sort of types of beauty, certain types of, on the whole, racial identities. You know, they're a certain height. So, for instance, if I knew the woman who wore this tea gown and I wanted to exhibit it, I can't put it on a mannequin that looks like Kate Moss because it's completely ridiculous. I mean, in terms of the height, you know, the posture, the aesthetic, the look, everything about it's completely wrong. And so, yeah, as curators, it's the constant dilemma because our work's always criticised because it can't be seen in movement, and it can't be seen in movement because once the garments come into the museum, they can never be worn again. And in any exhibition, it's nearly always, the mannequins are usually the most expensive component, aren't they? And funnily enough, where our exhibitions are critiqued, it's actually not the clothes or the putting together of the clothes that's critiqued. Quite often, it's the mannequins. So you have to really, really think about what you're going to do. So you have standard solutions. We can use the dressmaker dummy, which we can pin into, and it has no sense of head or body. Sometimes I've had garments sculpted. I've had cheap mannequins bought and sculpted to the exact contours of the garment, which is a skilled job and it's expensive. And an exhibition I'm about to start working on is about a lesbian artist who lived in Brighton in Sussex, called herself Gluck and wore man-tailored clothing. She's not much taller than me. And what sort of mannequin do I use? So to me that's as big a dilemma, and it's as important a decision as the words I use to describe those clothes. So every exhibition we stage, it's the biggest dilemma subject-wise, but it's also the biggest dilemma financially, and we have to temper the two. You know, ideally you want the proportion of a head, but sometimes you sacrifice that because the head that you could use is wrong. Or you do what Diana Vreeland did and wrap it up in a scarf.
I mean, I think that the word fashion is very powerful because the minute it's fashion, I think people expect kind of the fashionable. And I think the past intentionally was a kind of, in a way, unfashionable title. It was intentionally kind of evocative, but also kind of distanced in a way from the word fashion. And Amy and I worked on a book together, and the book was called Exhibiting Fashion Before and After 1971. And 1971 was a very important date to us, because within a history of fashion exhibitions and exhibition making, the exhibition staged by Cecil Beaton at the V&A in 1971 was particularly seminal. And one of the things he did was engage with fashion that was current, but his attitude to the styling of the show, as you can see here, you may not think that this is an exhibition staged in 1971. You can see the schlappy mannequin that you can probably see downstairs. So in a way, one of the things that we're dealing with are the same tools, and tools that overlap over a very long period of time. And one of the things, as I said, is a kind of recurring preoccupation with this project is how to differentiate between the retail spaces downstairs and the project that we're engaged in. But what if this is one of our histories? So this is also our past, an exhibition from 1971 that looks remarkably like a lot of the retail spaces downstairs. And so there's a kind of preoccupation that is embedded within this project. Do you want to give a little bit more context about the Beaton project and our different roles within it?
Well, the exhibition was staged in 1971, and at that time the V&A didn't engage with contemporary fashion at all. Where dress was collected, it was collected for its textile significance, not for its cut and its fashionability. And Cecil Beaton went to the museum director and proposed that he collected the clothes from all the famous women and photographers and all the people he worked with over the last 40 or 50 years, and collected their clothes and exhibited them and gave them to the museum. And the exhibition, it was as you walked into the V&A, and it was completely popular, and there was a section on Bieber, which I wanted to ask Barbara about. And so it was a series of all different, it was like lots of exhibitions in one. It was a huge perspex structure And there were themes that were based on decades. So there was like the 1930s, the 1950s. There was one section called royalty, of course, for Cecil Beaton, who loved the Queen. There were sections on space age, on fashion and surrealism. There was some devoted to single designers, the Balenciaga, Schiaparelli and surrealism, this one. And in many ways, it was all the dilemmas of the exhibitions that we do today in one. You know, do we do it by decade? Do we do it by designer? Do we do it by theme? And then in what context do we do it? So here they've there was money for this exhibition too. They commissioned a painter to create backgrounds in the style of Dali, Salvador Dali, and yeah, an amazing installations. I think when you think, I mean, this still looks incredibly contemporary. So for the book, we thought this was our starting point, and we discussed it with our students so often. And so my role was, well, I was given a set of 35mm slides, which is why the quality is so bad, that were taken in 1971. And I had 2 sets of hard copy photographs made, and for about 3 years we both walked around with these photographs stuck into notebooks. I tried to identify each of the clothes, who'd worn them, and find out about the type of mannequins. And then Judith did things which completely astounded me, which would never ever have crossed my mind. Like the fact that there's little perspex numbers in front of the garments. And it had dawned on Judith, as it would only on Judith, that the numbers were higher than the number of garments in the exhibition. So that was one of the things Judith wrote about. I mean, amongst other things, but just 2 eyes looking at things so differently. And Judith reconstructed the exhibition, so for her, it was really, I mean, I just looked at each set, whereas Judith wanted to know, as an architect, you know, what did you see when you were looking at that one, because it was a 2-tier exhibition, you know, could you see the Charles James dress, you know, and at the same time the Balenciaga, and just completely different preoccupations, but both of us completely obsessed. Yeah.
And I guess tonight, I mean, we're not going to talk for much longer because we wanted half this session to be about your questions. But I think this book was the beginning of something that in a way is the point of the exhibition next door, which is that it's about these conversations about what to retrieve. And it was striking to us how differently we were looking at this set of photographs, that we were looking at completely different things. And as Amy said, you know, that I was looking at perspex numbers, which makes me I just seem like a very odd person. But the fact of putting numbers that exceeded the number of dresses is, of course, a clue to the number of dresses that were collected and then written about in the catalogue, and a kind of clue to the enormity of a collecting project that wasn't actually reflected in the exhibition itself. And so it's a way in which exhibitions always exceed their brief in a way. They always allude to something kind of off-scene. And that's something that interested us so much about these kind of overlapping histories. I mean, one of the ways that this is evoked in the exhibition next door is the captions are overlaid onto different images. There's a kind of archaeology, in a way, implied around the idea of research and the idea of what information you choose to put on a caption. And so the caption stands are, in a way, an event in themselves, because that's what we do. That's our process of research and editing. And one of my preoccupations is always about how to kind of perform that within an exhibition space. How do you perform 2 captions at once? How do you perform indecision? How do you perform, in a way, changing your mind? And so this comes on the back of 2 exhibitions that some of you have seen in this series, the second of which I think a lot of people walked into the space and thought it was the same as the first exhibition, which was called Morphing, which was about changing one's mind and changing the kind of minutiae of an exhibition, which of course is not a luxury you can have retrospectively. So this is a book that that we wrote together in as two halves, and as something that we thought would benefit mainly our students. We run a master's course together, but in a way the changing of our mind was about sort of more eyes on one exhibition and how far you might deconstruct an exhibition when looking at it. Do you want to add anything before we open it up to the floor?
Not that I can think of.
Would anyone like to ask us some questions about this?
Sure. In light of the fact that we are in a retail space, and also in light of the fact that museums often, portray the please exit through the gift shop mentality, how do you remain impartial from the billion-dollar fashion engine?
You can do what I do, which is retreat into history.
Well, I mean, there is a point in that if something is not available for sale, in a way you're safe, and I would say in a way you're not, because one of the first things that people say when they see the red jacket next door is it looks like an Alexander McQueen, as in that you're still in a way conforming to a kind of contemporary aesthetic, whether it's one that is quite literally for sale or not. So there are lots of grey areas, I think, around, but when it's it can be more or less literal, I guess. How you engage with that?
Because we could also say that in the same way there were changing trends in fashion, clothing, there are also changing trends in academic curatorial preoccupations, and so it's not a coincidence that there's an exhibition of Ozzy Clark at a particular point in time, or an exhibition of Balenciaga, because usually those exhibitions are staged at a point in time where they have a contemporary that resonates often with what's happening now. So those garments from the 1890s, the red jacket, we're looking at it with very different eyes than we might have looked at it 10, 15 years ago, when it wouldn't have been infinitely desirable as it is today. So yeah, you're right. We can't separate ourselves completely.
Is your background in art history? How were you trained, and how did you get into the world of fashion?
I'm going to say the completely obvious thing, which people always say at interview, which was that I always liked dress. But I always liked dress, but I did a design history degree, and the changing moment for me was that, well, I went particularly to do it because there was a history of dress component, and I think I'd had an education where I wasn't inspired, and I was very average. I was taught by someone, Lou Taylor, who inspired me she just took me somewhere else. And there's one of the seminal moments I remember is, the first course was looking at the history of fashion from 1850 to 1900, and everyone could choose their subject, and because I was polite, I stood back, and I wanted Worth's crinoline gowns, and I ended up with the working conditions of tailors in London's East End, and I was gutted. But I talked to Lou for about 10 minutes, and she completely turned it around. And so I think that's what got me this sort of interest in social history. And I then went to the Royal College and did a master's by thesis, and I in the 1980s, and wrote about cheap levels of ready-to-wear in the 1920s. So I looked at, it was the myth and the reality. It was looking at what Chanel was designing, and then looking at sort of what working class, what girls working in factories were wearing. And I have to say, the two things I said I would never do was teach and work in a museum, and they're the two things that I do and I absolutely adore. But I think I had a very fixed idea about what working in a museum would be like and what curators would be like. And then it became obvious that the two career routes were teaching, which you could get, and working in a museum, which was like gold dust. And then I started thinking, actually, yeah, I like old things, I like objects, maybe I would like museums. And I got a part-time job in the local museum where you had to work with everything. You stuck the labels, you did 17th century glasses one day, toys another day. And I was teaching as well at the art college, very terrified teaching fashion students about my age. And I bought the Guardian one day, there was an advert for curator of 20th century dress at the V&A, and I thought very boldly that I'd apply for it, but I thought, they're not even going to interview me, I've never worked with the dress collection. And they did interview me, and I had to give a talk in front of all the other applicants, which was very scary. Anyway, I got the job and then worked there for 9 years, and yeah, I just completely fell in love with working in museums and teaching.
Thank you.
And Judith's completely different route.
I'm an architect by training, and so in a way that's why I always look at exhibitions in the round, because it's always about sort of populating space in a way. Even though it's all dress is always at its centre for me, but I mean I guess in terms of starting an exhibition process, it's always sketching the space first of all, and populating it, I guess, with kind of structures that act very much as captions, which is why Amy was talking about the kind of op art, you know, the anecdote about looking at the op art section next door. For me, the kind of the mise en scène is the caption to the dress. You know, you need the kind of confusion around looking to understand something perhaps about the garments, or certainly about the garments within this exhibition, you know, with this remit.
And you've transformed our discipline because of that, which is what she hasn't said.
Hearing you speak, excuse me, I'm reminded of, you don't think of George Orwell when you think of fashion, but his famous adage about he who controls the present controls the past, and who controls the past controls the future. So is your job then is to reposition the past for the contemporary audience?
Well, I don't mind, we both have an answer. Well, I mean, I suppose I would say that anything was a construct, so whether we write a book, which is a history, or we stage an exhibition, it's a construct. I mean, it can't be you know, it's our perception in the present day. We might be terrible, however rigorous we are with our research, whatever we write or whatever we curate, we have to be incredibly reflective, because it's completely shaped by our own preoccupations. We go to the archive, we make notes on that, we don't make notes on that. You know, it's so, I would say it was a construct, whatever. There's no such thing as recreating the past.
Not repositioning.
Repositioning, sorry.
Not recreating.
Not recreating, repositioning.
Reposition the past.
Inevitably, I guess we do that too.
I mean, I think that in terms of our discipline, what we're doing more and more is kind of declaring our hand, I guess. You know, that the curator is becoming more conspicuous. And there's a whole kind of debate about that as well, in terms of kind of working against the idea of the curator being invisible and you know, in order to privilege the artwork. Whereas I think now it's not about not privileging the artwork, but it's about declaring our hand.
Yeah.
And I think in a way it's declaring that hand. It's saying, this is, you know, beware, this is not objective.
Yeah, and I think when I started working in museums, there was a really strong feeling that as a curator you had to have a sort of you had to be incredibly objective and sort of have a detachment, where now, of course, I mean, you can't be objective. You know, I think you look at the V&A's dress collection when I was there, it reflects my preoccupations, what I collected. I leave, they stop collecting street style clothes, they collect different things. It's...
Oh, you're talking about this exhibition, I don't know anything about it. But it seems like he's repositioned his entire relationship with fashion photographer for that moment in 1971.
Yeah.
But he also changed the course of the V&A collection, because what Cecil Beaton did was use his kind of what now would be described as celebrity, but in those days would be called society, friends and clients to encourage them to donate to the V&A. And so now if you look at the kind of accession numbers at the V&A, so much couture says 1971, actually it was re-accessioned and re-documented in 1974. But I mean, time and time again, some of the most exquisite couture in the V&A collection comes from that moment. So of course exhibitions are also moments of acquisition. And so the preoccupation then is kind of fixed in stone, if you like, because it becomes the permanent collection from which the curators then draw. And so in terms of our theme of interpreting the past, it's very important because it becomes the curator's library.
Why do you think that we've gone from 1971 with Cecil Beaton's exhibit being somewhat of an aberration to now that fashion exhibits in large museums are the biggest blockbusters, Alexander McQueen and Chaos to Couture. So now and it's not just women and people interested in fashion, everybody's going. They're huge. So what happened?
Well, when I started working at the V&A in 1991, it was an absolute turning point because there's a hierarchy of curators. It's not written, but it's completely explicit. And if you're the sculpture curator, you're a whole lot higher than the fashion curator. But it was a bit of a double-edged sword because it was the fashion curator who was bringing people in. It was the fashion books that were selling. And it comes down to a completely basic premise is that we all wear clothes. And we can all relate to them and we all have an opinion on them. And when I worked there, I always used to say that, the other museums nearby were more family-led museums. And in some ways the V&A was more hushed. But I always used to say, well, you could find your way to the dress gallery blindfolded because there was such a lot of noise. Because everyone, from children, everyone, even if you just thought, imagine wearing that. And so I think dress became popular in that sense. It also became, it fed into a lot of academic preoccupations. So in the early 1980s on to the 1990s, sociology and women's studies, geography, all sorts of academic disciplines architecture started engaging with fashion. And also there was a huge vogue for costume dramas, which draws lots of people. It's a hook to get people interested into historical dress. And suddenly, in about 1997, you get all sorts of museums that would never have engaged with dress, like the Royal Academy, like, if for instance, the National, not National Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery do an exhibition of paintings, rather than doing it on a genre or an artist, they do it on the theme of drapery. And the Imperial War Museum in 1997 did an exhibition about wartime fashion. It was the most popular exhibition they ever had. It was so popular they extended the run, and they've been doing fashion exhibitions ever since. So it's about being inclusive, and you can attract a huge audience, and it's also about survival. It's about museums needing to bring people in, and if you have a fashion element, you bring people in, or a dress element. And it isn't just women interested in fashion, it's people of all ages, and social groups. We can all relate to dress on some level, even if we say we're not interested in fashion and don't do it, that is making a statement. And now it's phenomenally popular, and also now everyone is a curator. There was an advert for a lifestyle curator the other day, and there's a book on one of these shelves which is about a culinary curator. So we've gone from being really quite an old-fashioned discipline to being, our discipline's very cool at the moment.
I think it is extraordinary how exhibitions like the Alexander McQueen exhibition has kind of fixed the discipline in people's eyes. People who sort of thought, what is it you do? Suddenly it's kind of been confirmed in a completely different way. And I think it's an even kind of broader group of people who saw that show to certainly any other show that I can think of that has has dress. But it was also the commitment by the museum to stage something kind of at that level, because dress curators were certainly sort of second-class citizens for a very, very long time, and so the budgets didn't support exhibitions of that on that scale.
Any other questions? Anybody else? The last question that wasn't asked. I want to thank Judith and Amy. Development at Bell Harbor Shops for so generously sponsoring Fashion Project, this entire annual series, programs such as tonight. And please take a program with you so you see what we're offering throughout the season. And also there's a guest book to sign, and we'll add you to our e-list if you sign our guest book. And please visit the past now with new eyes and have another set of eyes to look at it. And thank you so much for such a wonderful, really conversation.